I'd now like to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening. I think it's fair to say Tasneem Essop has done it all. She's had a distinguished career across a range of different domains. Just reading her bio is almost dizzying, the amount of things you've done. Tasneem Essop is an expert on climate, energy, poverty and social justice issues, and is the founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa, where she is from, and where I think you told me previously you've lived all your life. She has significant experience in the climate movement. She was a global climate policy strategy leader for environmental NGO WWF International, and served as the head of delegation for the organization at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, including at the Paris COP21 in 2015. She's serving her second term as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa. She's also held a number of senior government positions, including Provincial Minister for the Environment, Planning and Economic Development, and Provincial Minister of Transport, Public Works and Property Management in the Western Cape in South Africa. Before becoming a member of the Western Cape Provincial Legislature in 1994, Tasneem was a trade unionist in Kosatu, Western Cape. She's also a qualified teacher, an incredible array of expertise, and her current role is as Executive Director of Climate Action Network International, the international umbrella body for climate civil society groups. We're very grateful, Tasneem, for you joining us here this evening. I know you've had a really busy couple of days. Tasneem spoke at Trócaira's 50th anniversary conference yesterday. Then she spoke at a climate justice roundtable that I had the pleasure of attending this morning in the city centre. She's been speaking to some Irish politicians this afternoon. So, and you're departing Ireland tomorrow morning. So we're really grateful for you taking the time to join us here this evening. Tasneem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dermot, and greetings to you all. This is such an immense privilege for me to be here, even if I did have a very, it's Troika's fault, a very intensive program in the past 2 days. This is the moment that I will enjoy because I'm looking forward to engagement. So I'm not here to make a big speech, but for us to have a conversation about a very challenging and complex issue on climate change. I'm not going to say when last I've actually been in a lecture theatre like this because I'll expose my age, but it's fantastic to be here with you this evening. I must say, I was telling Siobhan, I wonder if people will actually come on a Friday night with this amazing weather, and people would probably be out socializing. And so I'm super impressed that you all sacrificed your time this evening to come and have this engagement. So I was asked to talk about, well, a few things. Climate justice as the overarching conversation that we need to have in, our way of addressing climate change, but also to look at the underlying, what I'll call politics of climate change, and the politics that influences our ability to really respond to a crisis that is absolutely global in scale with the required actions to take care of that crisis. Why is it that we're not seeing the kind of actions that we need to take to address the climate crisis? So first I'd like to ask, how many of you consider yourself climate justice activists? Good, okay. Well, I hope at the end of this evening, the whole room will be climate justice warriors. But there's a good start is, of course, that you're doing the course and you've chosen to do that. Now, when we talk about climate justice in the wider climate movement, we're really referring to the very sharp injustice where this crisis caused by those historically industrialized countries, rich nations, the developed world, your development in the north, your dependence on fossil fuels to drive that development, driving a global climate crisis, and those least responsible for that historically, now bearing the worst impacts of that crisis. Right, so that is the core of the injustice. It's just the core. Those least responsible for the global crisis, mainly those countries in the global south. And within that, of course, there are very large sections of societies that are marginalized, live through inequality, suffering from poverty, etc. That would be more women, children, the elderly, etc. So there's sections of our society that are most vulnerable. And then there are countries who are least responsible, and yet they are bearing the burden of the climate crisis. That's the injustice. Does that make sense to you? Right? If you're responsible for something, take responsibility. So that's the core of the injustice that climate justice activists want addressed. It's not a comfortable conversation to have, because how comfortable did it feel for you when I tell you that your development also caused damage elsewhere? It's not a comfortable conversation, but it's a necessary conversation. So we'll talk about it tonight. In addressing this global crisis, then, as you know, all these governments come together under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate, and they negotiate. And it's not been easy. And of course, Paris, and as you know, I was there. It took hard work to get the global agreement. But one of the things that happened in the course of negotiating that agreement was the attempt to equalize responsibility, if I can call it that, right? Global North, Global South. Oh, we shouldn't have these distinctions between developing countries. We're all in this together. We're all responsible, rightly so. We should all take responsibility. But in that equalizing of responsibility, the issue of addressing the injustice gets lost. So how do the forms within that kind of UN Framework Convention negotiations, what are the forms of addressing the injustice? One of the most important, of course, as all developing countries would say, the important priorities would be how do we ensure that the global north provides the financial support to the global south to be able to take climate action, of course, to make a contribution to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, but more importantly, for many of the, especially least developing countries, small island states, how do we adapt to climate? And then there is something that is beyond adaptation. You can't adapt beyond a certain limit. And this is what we call the loss and damage issue. The impacts of climate change that we cannot adapt to. And we're witnessing the frequency and the devastation of those climate impacts. And right now, as we're sitting here, I'm sure you would have followed what's happening in the rest of the world, what's happening in Greece, what happened in Spain, what's happened in California with the fires, etc., Hong Kong. So climate impacts are becoming more devastating, as we're clearly witnessing. It's not, confined to global south countries. It's impacting us across the board. The difference, though, is that the ability to recover from those impacts is what's differentiating us. So in the global south, and if you're following climate and development issues, you would know that most countries in the developing world, they're reeling with a debt burden. the debt burden is further exacerbated by the fact that because there's no financial support for dealing with these extreme disasters, they're using their budgets to address the recovery domestically with no international support, and that just closes the fiscal space to be able to address all the other development challenges in their countries, whether that's education, whether that's health, whether that is housing, etc. So there's an already existing development crisis that gets exacerbated by the climate crisis, and there's no financial support from those who are most responsible for the crisis to these countries. So clearly, climate finance is a very important intervention to address the injustice. The problem is that many developed countries in these negotiations, unfortunately, consider the discussions on climate finance as a burden. We don't have the money, this is going to place a burden on our countries, or view it as this is charity, this is aid, we're already giving too much to the South, etc. Now, I've said this, and I'm sorry, Dermot, and those of you who attended the previous meetings. Recently, there was a study, a piece of research done by Jason Hickel, and I think Andrew Fanning is the name of the other researcher. And it was a research piece done on how much the global North owes the global South in terms of climate debt. What do you think that figure sounds like? What do you think that would be? 170 trillion. That is for the excessive use of carbon budget. The remaining space that we have, the carbon space that we have. So the excessive emissions generated by the global North really, using up the majority of the carbon budget that we are, we still have maybe, especially in the global South for our development, that debt is 170 trillion. And they were able to even tell you which countries owe what amount. It's a good study. You should look it up and then look at that. Now, when you start thinking about justice, the owing of a climate debt, and that figure is in the 170 trillions, that doesn't include all the elements of colonial debt and colonial reparations, etc. That doesn't, all the outflows from developing countries to developed countries, it's not including that. Just the climate debt is 170 trillion. And then we have the conversation about climate finance. And this conversation we have about climate finance is about this little minuscule amount that we all know about, the 100 billion that developed countries committed to providing to developing countries about 14 years ago in Copenhagen. An amount that was just a thumbsuck amount by Hillary Clinton. And here we are all fighting about 100 billion, but what is owed to the South is 170 trillion. That puts climate finance into perspective. And global South countries are not going to go banging on the doors and saying, we want that 100. They should actually, but obviously they won't. It's, probably crazy, we'd be called mad. But it is important to keep that into perspective when we have the conversation on climate finance. That's what's owed, but we're not getting it. So this is going to be a big, big fight. And the fault lines between global North countries and global South countries, unfortunately, they're getting deeper. The levels of trust between the two blocks are like at its lowest levels ever. And the fight really is around finance. There's a big pressure on developing countries to do much more, and rightly so, we should. There's a big pressure, of course, when we talk about, but what about loss and damage? They constantly want the conversation to be about emission reductions, and that's absolutely fine. But with the levels of inaction, and again, the North had to go fast and deeper in terms of cutting, which they haven't. And as you all know, as we sit here, There are big developed countries that's still extending fossil fuel permits and licenses, the very drivers of the climate crisis. And they're putting pressure on the South to take more action in cutting emissions while not doing this themselves. And inaction results in loss and damage. All these impacts is because of that. Not enough actions to bring down greenhouse gases. So while there's inaction, and we put the loss and damage issue, it's been on the table for over 30 years, and the North did not want to discuss it. Why? Because they were fearing the idea of reparation. The US literally actually didn't want to agree in Paris because they didn't want liability. So it's a footnote in the Paris Agreement. So the resistance dealing with that, but we're suffering losses and damage. So what do? Allow people to just suffer, to lose their livelihoods, to die, while we're waiting for action to be more ambitious? So it was our moral responsibility, and also in the interest of justice, that we had to fight for loss and damage and finance for loss and damage. That's it. And as civil society, we played a really important role from Glasgow to put this back on the agenda, to fight for it in a united way. And we won. We won. I'm sure you know that, right? That we won a loss and damage fund. Yes? No? Okay, these are all geeky things maybe. But it's really important because it was a justice issue to win that battle. And so in COP27 in Egypt last year, we managed to get an agreement by all these parties, and pulling those ones that didn't ever want to address this across the line. And we got the agreement on establishing the fund. But the fight is not over. So that was a little victory, opened the door. Now the backlash is happening. Now the developed countries are taking positions again. Oh, but we shouldn't call this a loss and damage fund. This is the US. Oh, but we need to put the fund in the World Bank. Oh, but we shouldn't deal with extreme weather events. We should deal with something else. So we suspected that that would happen. And so we're still struggling. Let's hope the agreements gets reached, because this is the only mechanism, and also a signal, a hopeful signal to those who are suffering the impacts of climate change, that we are taking care of their needs and that we've heard their voice. Why did this become so important? And Dermot, I might be veering off what you wanted me to speak about. No. Am I okay? No, I just need to talk about this issue. Why has this polarization increased in recent years between the global North and the global South? We've just come through a global pandemic. What happened during the pandemic? The global North had the ability to deal with the pandemic, did they not? Vaccines got developed in the global North. When the global South reached out and asked for help with vaccines, not just the provision of vaccines, but we asked, can you please bring down your intellectual property rights and allow for the global South to manufacture this? To do what? To save lives. To save lives in the global South. The global North said no. They literally said no. So during the pandemic, the message we received in the global South was that our lives are expendable. That when there's a global crisis, the North will turn inwards, take care of themselves, their citizens, and rightly so, and their businesses. But they're not going to consider the solidarity that is required to save the lives across the board. So they stepped inward. Now, and I said this as well yesterday, what is the message to us in the global South? That is this a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis? When we are going to need technologies to help us to adapt, to respond to the crisis in any way? Is this about this protectionism again? Or are we going to act in the public good for the global common? Is your business interest going to be more important than making sure the solutions to address the crisis is actually rolled out at a global scale? These are very important ethical and moral questions as well. And again, underpinned by addressing the issue of injustice. So there's the experience of the COVID injustice and inequality, and that's very alive in the minds of those who are sitting at the tables negotiating these agreements on climate right now. And the fight is harsh and it's heavy. You know, we think we're going to make progress and then it's all blown up. In the recent discussions in Bonn, there's a big fight between the rich nations and developing countries around climate finance again. So what's the underlying kind of politics? I've given you an example of the kind of inequality that we've lived through historically, by the way. So these things are not about the now either, right? And for those of you studying your climate and society, you would have probably read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. How many of you have read the Intergovernmental, blah, blah, blah? Okay.
Even started yet.
Oh, but they're ready, Dermot, they're ready. They're ready, they're ahead. So, very important, if you haven't read it, there's summaries. Don't go read the thick report, it can be quite hectic. There's a summary. And for the first time in a science report, it's now multidisciplinary, which is really a good thing. They mentioned the C word. What is the C word? Colonization. For the first time ever. Scientists recognize that you can't deal with what's happening now without recognizing the historical path which comes through colonization. That's really important because that history is important for us to understand the now and why developing countries are not actually capable and resourced enough to be able to address such a global crisis or a health crisis as it was. There's a history to that. So we need to, in your studies, please be familiar that you can't just see climate change like this. Climate change is absolutely connected to a number of other issues. That includes the history of the world, that includes development, that includes the connections between race, class, gender. It includes all of that. It includes social justice. So when we talk about climate justice, please, you cannot have climate justice without social justice. It includes how our economic systems work. It includes how our political systems work. Global governance works. All of these are connected. So don't think if you're going to be addressing climate change, you're going to sit in your bubble and this is just an emissions problem. It will not be addressed. There's no way we'll address the crisis in a just way if we just did that. So that's the first one. Secondly, the climate negotiations, not about climate, it's about politics and power. It's about interests and vested interests. It's about those who are going to, ensure that their domestic interests are far more important than addressing a global crisis that affects all of us. So these negotiations are, about trade, actually. It's about the Security Council and security. It's about the economic development and growth of your country or sectors. And of course, the fossil fuel industry's interests are right there in the center of all of that. And so these negotiations to reach global agreements are deeply influenced by all of those issues. And as I said, the rich nations have dug in their heels and the global south are not going to take that anymore. But the global north are still highly resourced. This is the injustice and inequality of the world. And so the power comes with that. And so you don't want to toe the line? That's it. Trade between us comes to an end or will diminish our relationships, etc. So they use all methods and there's a particular attempt to try and break the unity of the global south. Not that the global south is united and homogeneous, right? I mean, in the G77 plus China, the largest bloc negotiating in the UNFCCC, there's sub-blocks of interests, also vested interests. The Saudis, the Gulf states are there. They obviously would love to protect, their fossil fuel wealth. We have small island states who is fighting for existence, survival. Least developing countries. We have the emerging economy. South Africa is classified as an emerging economy, which we're not. We have the highest levels of unemployment ever right now, highest levels of inequality, poverty, etc. So you have different blocks with different interests. But the one exciting thing, of course, is that this very diverse bloc stood united on the loss and damage fund. We were only able to get that, well, civil society with standing shoulder to shoulder with the G77 plus China to get it across the line. So you can imagine that the politics of these negotiations, really informed by what I would call vested interests, the idea that your national interests would trump the interests of all of us. And those national interests, as I said, would be related to your economy, your trade, your security, etc. And that's why you cannot address the climate crisis in just a kind of bubble, siloed view. And that politics of power, resources, plays itself out in the negotiations, and we are essentially in a very bad place. And we're really worried about what the outcomes would be, especially in this important one, the COP28 in Dubai. And the last point I want to make, because I'm sure I went over time a lot, is that when we fought for justice through the establishment of a loss and damage fund, that was dealing with the consequences of the climate crisis and the consequences of inaction or not enough action. It was necessary, as I told you, because you couldn't allow people to suffer the impacts that we're already experiencing. But what we need to do this year, in addition to making sure the loss and damage fund gets operationalized, is to address the causes of climate change. And can you imagine that the only convention addressing climate change and the negotiations around that, the UN negotiations, has never, ever, ever addressed the key driver of climate change, and that is fossil fuels. Never. In Glasgow, there was some reference to it, very weak language, but this year, you know, movements, and there are many governments also who have taken a position about this. We do want to see very explicitly an agreement that all countries will have a just and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, all fossil fuels, not just coal, as they said in Glasgow, and that there must be a very rapid, scaled up phase in of renewable energy, but with financial support. There's no way developing countries can do such a radical transformation of their economies and societies without financial support. That just transition has to be funded. The scaling up of renewable energy specifically needs funding. So certainly that's going to be a big fight. Firstly, to get countries, and especially those who are dependent on fossil fuels and still issuing license, to agree to phasing out. And again, rich nations have to go first and fast. And they're not doing it still today. They put pressure on the emerging economies who are coal dependent, like South Africa. You have to stop, you have to phase out. And then they issue licenses, which makes our task difficult when we need to convince our governments that we need to end our use of fossil fuels. And we are just told, but look, the industrial line, they're still carrying on. What about our development? You can imagine that narrative that gets built up, and there's a double standard, and there's a sense of injustice. So politics, power, justice, injustice, inequality, all of these things, fairness, morality, all of these, ethical, all of these play into the work that we need to do to address this climate crisis. It's not simple, it's hell of a complicated, and we should not be shy. And also, I do want to end off by saying, everything sounds so big and unmanageable, and we can't do this, but please, please do not despair, because we've had in our history, some of it in our lifetimes, crises before. but we won. We won many of those big global struggles, whether it was our struggle against, well, we weren't around, but slavery, whether it was the struggles against colonialism, whether it was the struggle of against apartheid in my country, whether it was the feminist movements fighting for the right for women to vote, etc., etc. There have been big battles, and it took all of us, all of people's power to bring about that change. You all have power. And your ability to use that, use your agency is really important in times of global crisis, and for all of us to stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity with each other, not turn inward and say, I need to take care of my life only. Your life plus. That serves justice, and we must ensure justice across the board, and specifically climate justice when we're addressing this very devastating, urgent crisis that we're all facing right now. Thank you, Dermot.